Final Fantasy II blows. While I don't hate everything about it, Final Fantasy II is a big letdown after such a promising first outing, with such problematic design decisions like replacing your fourth party member with a bunch of underpowered randoms, and by being a ridiculously unbalanced game in general. Instead of the first game's leveling system where your overall stats go up every time you level, Final Fantasy II makes it so skills only level up if you use them, like Oblivion. So we have Aya, my mage. She sits in the back of my formation and, as a result, takes way less damage than the rest of the party. But she can only level up her health if she takes damage. It doesn't matter how many enemies she kills. Her magic and attack will go up, but her HP will not unless she gets smacked. This EXP gain requirement means you'll need to do a whole ton of grinding if you want to survive since the game is so unbalanced. Like an unacceptable amount of grinding. Or you have another option. Attack and heal yourself. Yes, the best way to level in Final Fantasy II is to ignore enemies and instead wail on your own teammates with different skills until you're super powerful. Your best bet is an exploit, and I hate it. I have many other problems with Final Fantasy II, but they've all been discussed in a previous video, so I won't go into it more here. So you can imagine my delight when, upon starting Final Fantasy III after the dreadful experience that was 2, I found a fun, imaginative, and relatively well-designed sequel in the spirit of the first game, though missing some depth when it comes to the plot. That said, nearly every fiber of the Final Fantasy experience is approved upon here that, even after playing through and reflecting on all 3 games, it's still blowing my mind how much this one stands out. I understand what Square was trying to do in the second game by essentially removing the class system to have complete freedom to build your character, but it was implemented quite poorly. Some people didn't like me saying that in my video on the second game, and you're entitled to like it, but I'm also entitled to not. A few of you have also told me that the Saga series approaches these mechanics better, and that's awesome, and I'd like to try it one day on your guys' recommendation. But Saga's success doesn't change the fact that 2's implementation is awful. And if FF2's system is so good, why did they completely ditch it only one game later, instead choosing to revamp on the first game's ideas? Point is, Final Fantasy III is an impressive game made even more so when compared to its direct predecessor. But why is that the case? What changes improved and took away from the franchise's third entry, and who is behind them? Let's get into it. Final Fantasy III was first released in Japan on April 27, 1990 for the Famicom. It didn't reach outside Japan, however, until the Nintendo DS remake in 2006, which changes a fair amount of the game. And while the DS version was ported to mobile devices, the PSP, and even Steam, it wasn't until 2021's Pixel Remaster that the original 2D version was available officially outside of Japan, and that's the version I played for this video. Final Fantasy III tells the tale of a great earthquake that tore apart the land, taking its source of light, the crystals, into its depths, and bringing out monsters of all sorts that now endanger the living. Another catastrophe is on the horizon, but there's still hope in the form of 4 orphans exploring a cave nearby their village. That cave ends up housing one of the said crystals, and we take control of the orphans to start our adventure. Right away, things start going wrong. Our team falls through a sinkhole into an unexplored part of the cave, and we witness them communicating with one another, which, thank hell, as inter-team communication was one of the only good parts of Final Fantasy II, so I'm glad that feature carried over. Also, I'm playing the Pixel Remaster, and this in-game font is pure garbage, so I used a mod to convert the text to a more classic feel. Installation is quite easy, and I'll link to the Steam guide in the description below so you can do it yourself. On that note, if you're a classic FF3 player, you'll notice a few brazen changes from the original game. The most notable difference is the minimap on the top right. Now, I can see this being contentious for some players, as the minimap is helpful in certain areas that are intentionally deceiving, especially towards the end game. The minimap also allows the player to examine all of the chests in an area, planning out their path to minimize random battles and still gather all of the area's loot. Avoiding battles is a pro in that I can get through areas faster and save items, but also a negative as fewer battles means less XP and potentially feeling underpowered in later areas, forcing the age-old grind. Either way, I don't think the minimap ruins the experience or anything, but it is a tweak that helps make the game more accessible to modern players, which is never a bad thing. That aside, this is the first game to introduce a tutorial of sorts by utilizing your party's dialogue. Exploring the cave, we'll see Max wanting to drink from a spring, which will teach the player that springs restore your party's health and magic. Previous entries weren't as blatant about mechanics like this, and there's more of that as the intro goes on. I also noticed right away that all characters earn EXP after a battle, removing that busted mechanic from Final Fantasy II, which I am just so grateful for. After getting through the cave, we find a wind crystal guarded by a simply terrifying land turtle, which I beat with little struggle. The crystal speaks to us, stating that we're the chosen ones and that darkness is set to envelop all light in the world. It's up to us to prevent that light from fading, and to assist in that journey, the crystal grants us our first few jobs, which are essentially classes, just called something different. I build my initial party very similar to that of the first game, with Max as a warrior, Aya as a healing-centric white mage, Norm as the damage-focused black mage, and Liara as a monk. While it wasn't apparent at first, after playing through the game I realized that the job system is a brilliant innovation on the ideas presented in the first game while fixing the level customization problems introduced in Final Fantasy II. In FF1, you set your character's jobs from 6 choices: a fighter, a black belt, a thief, a black mage, a white mage, or a red mage. You can also choose any combination of these 4, from 4 thieves to 2 mages and 2 fighters, or a party in which every job is unique. These jobs have promotions later on in the game, like the thief evolving into a ninja, but each one evolves on a set path. Picking a class outright is a perfectly fine system, still present in many games today, but one could argue there's little in terms of customization. Once you pick a class, you're stuck with it. Final Fantasy II went all in on character customization, removing the class system entirely and having characters level up based on skill usage, and we all know how I feel about that. Final Fantasy III is a good balance of both, expanding the system to include over 20 jobs broken up into sets spread throughout the game. So starting the game, we have 6 jobs: the warrior, the monk, the 3 mage types, and the thief. I can make Max a warrior in one battle and swap him to a mage before the next, assuming I have the equipment to make that swap useful. And as you'll see throughout the video, when I unlock more jobs, I'm swapping between them more frequently to really take advantage of their skill sets. Now, you might think swapping between jobs is an immediate disadvantage, and in some ways it is. But switching jobs doesn't mean you're starting over entirely. Square balanced and even incentivized job switching by including 2 levels, a character level and a job level. A character level determines one's stats such as strength and agility, while job levels provide other benefits depending on the job of choice, such as increasing the number of hits when attacking, a higher chance of a critical hit, strengthening the power of damage and healing spells, or making job-specific skills such as jump or steal more effective. So if Max is a level 30 character with a level 25 warrior job, switching him to a red mage might give him a level 1 job, but he'll still be a level 30 character with all of the benefits that come alongside that, such as a reasonably leveled intelligence stat, making him immediately capable as a mage. It might sound weird that the job level doesn't affect stat growth, but that's a vital part of Final Fantasy III's emphasis on choice. Even better, each job keeps its level throughout the game, so if I switch him to a red mage for one battle and back to a warrior the next, his warrior job level will remain where I left it. Job levels are based on a hidden stat called job points. When a character's job points hit 99, their job level goes up 1. Characters gain job points pretty much all of the time, such as by attacking, defending, or using items. Also, each job earns an item upon reaching level 99, which is a neat incentive for players to max out multiple jobs. For instance, there's a super powerful lance for the Dragoon class called Gungur. However, it's only acquirable through a thief job's steal ability, which has to be used on the Odin enemy. The higher level the thief, the higher chance they are to steal Gungur. There's a whole system of hidden stats and equations to maximize builds, and it's all super neat despite being way too deep to detail here. So if you're interested, I've linked a couple of guides in the description below. All of this to say that the system is rock solid. It enables the player to completely customize their playstyle without punishing them for making shorter-term decisions. Sure, the long-term commitment of sticking with one class is better on a statistical level, but it's still entirely possible to make short-term swapping decisions thanks to the character level's stat buffer. All the player has to do is carry job-specific equipment with them to make each character effective, which is easily done thanks to Final Fantasy III's unlimited inventory space and item management. This level of customization is something more modern games like Oblivion struggled with so many years later. In fact, Bethesda didn't even solve the problem in its sequel, Skyrim, opting to simplify the leveling system instead. This discussion has its own nuances, of course, but that's for another video. Point is, Square solved the problem in 1990, proving that the company had some true game design geniuses back then, and that Final Fantasy III getting it right is a large reason the franchise is still around today. Another reason is the game's personality. 1 and 2 had their quirks, but Final Fantasy III goes all out all the time. We have moments like this man stuck in a haunted town who freaks out the second I talk to him, the main character playing the piano either poorly or really well depending on which side I stand on and gathering a crowd around, or the time our party is ambushed by a group of old dudes claiming to be the real heroes of light. This is even the Final Fantasy where Moogles come into play, serving a small but memorable role in the late game. Hell, one of the main story characters, Desh, is known by this town as a dude who let a girl on and simply left. He sounds like a proper shit, right? But when we find him stuck in a dragon's nest, we discover he's suffering from amnesia, only to find out even later that he's a descendant of an ancient race that built most of the technology the world uses to thrive even today. There's no shortage of ridiculous moments, and it's nice to see that Square had fun when building the game. But not only did Final Fantasy III explore a lighter, goofier tone and sense of self, it also portrayed a new sense of scale. When playing through Final Fantasy III's opening hours, I was a little worried about the game's length. You see, dungeons are smaller than they were in the previous two, meaning the game progresses much faster in general. There are lots of 3 and 4 floor dungeons that your party can breeze through, rather than a bunch of intense 7 to 10 floor areas. This change in design is due to a change in the game's battle philosophy. Instead of throwing more enemies at you, Square used the intricacies of its job system to create challenge. For example, shortly after finding the fire crystal and getting the first set of new jobs, a character in a nearby town notes that a certain enemy, Hein, can change his type strengths and weaknesses at will. To counter this, I would need a scholar job for its ability to scan enemy weaknesses. While Aya can also learn a spell that does this as a white mage, it's nice to have the ability built into a character without wasting any magic points. Or how about when fighting Garuda while attempting to save the kingdom of Saronia? Everyone in town says dragoons are the way to go thanks to their jump ability, so I make Max, Norm, and Liara dragoons and make them all jump to avoid a turn of damage, only for them to land on Garuda the next turn and do over 5k damage. So instead of overwhelming the player with enemies, Square opted for smaller dungeons with more unique monsters, requiring you to learn the ins and outs of your jobs by experimenting and talking to people if you want to gain an edge. However, not only were the dungeons smaller, it initially felt like the world map was smaller as well. While a world map wasn't available at all times in the original game, which required an item or a spell to view, it's available in the Pixel Remaster at all times. So, as I was exploring the region and checking off areas, even roaming around the world's edges on a chocobo, I wondered if Square would recycle content via the same map to add game length. But once I acquired an airship and flew out into the wild, I learned that this region is a small floating island hovering over a whole other set of lands. Well, when you first do this, you'll find that most of the other set of lands is underwater, but then you head to the water crystal with a water princess and drain it all, and then you realize you're on a small floating island hovering over a whole other set of lands. There was something magical about flying to the world's edge and having it lead to a whole other region, rather than bouncing me back with an invisible barrier or something lame like that. This moment is also when my fears about the game's length vanished completely. You leave to explore a new land before even acquiring the 3rd crystal, and it's here that one realizes that Square dreamt big when it comes to Final Fantasy III, at least when it comes to the game's world. Despite all this praise, Square's focus on scale and gameplay refinements meant the story took a bit of a back seat. As stated earlier, the main plot of Final Fantasy III isn't much different from the previous 2 games. There's an impending doom and a team of heroes must save the world. The evil Xande has flooded the lands, with one small floating island being the only refuge from this destruction. Our party has been raised on this island, knowing nothing of the greater world's fate. It isn't until we find a crystal of light that everything is revealed to us. Armed with the knowledge of what really happened, we drain the flood and set out to stop Xande from submerging the rest of the world into darkness. The overarching plot is serviceable, and that's fine, as it's the intricacies and in-game moments that matter. And in terms of those intricacies, Final Fantasy III is much closer to Game 1 than Game 2. Final Fantasy II was no joke. That game got right into the plot with your heroes losing a core teammate right from the start, and from there quests were tied directly to the main story, with dramatic moments like characters sacrificing themselves for my party, or us setting off to rescue the Princess of the Rebellion, only to find out that she's being held as a prize for whoever wins the Empire's Colosseum battle. That ends up being a trap, and we get broken out by another character, have to save the princess, and escape with our lives. As someone in the comments section of my Final Fantasy II video stated, 2's plot is good because it actually delves into the theme of war and its effects on everyone really well. For better or worse, it's focused on one theme the entire time. Final Fantasy I told a world-ending tale, but the majority of the game consisted of a string of random events, like stopping a vampire from terrorizing a town or overthrowing a pirate invasion, and while these moments are fun on their own, they don't add anything meaningful to the main plot. Final Fantasy III is also full of random events that make the game feel more like a sprawling adventure than the second game's more focused war story. Like the Vikings Cove, where I have to save a group of Vikings from a water dragon. It's neat, and it gives the game some personality, and we're rewarded a ship in the Fang of Water, which are items used to progress the plot, but these Vikings play no further role in the game. Really, this quest could have been anything, as long as it rewarded us with the Fang and the ship. My actions there have left no noticeable impact on the game's world, and instead just exist in a vacuum. There's never a point like in Final Fantasy II where we save the princess, head back to the rebel base, and prep to take a town back from the Empire. We take back the town and the rebels rightfully return to their spot on the throne before sending us off to find an Ultima Scroll to defeat the enemy. But to get the Ultima Scroll, we need an item from a long-forgotten dungeon underneath the castle we just fought to capture. All of these events tie into one another, and there's a logical progression between plot points. In 3, there's a point where a castle shoots down our airship, and we end up in a civil war orchestrated by some mage who's manipulating the king. We uncover the plot, stop the mage, and place the prince on the throne instead. They provide us with another airship, and we leave. The civil war was cool, yeah, but it didn't really contribute to the overall narrative. We dealt with it and got another airship, and then went on our main quest as if nothing happened. It feels like a mandatory side quest. Sure, the prince comes up once more at the end of the game as one of 5 pure hearts that prevent our party from being cursed, but that doesn't feel very consequential. There could have been 4 or 3 pure hearts needed instead of 5, or maybe our party could have had the pure parts necessary to help us resist the curse. It feels like the game's writers went, yeah, this civil war is cool, then realized it didn't contribute to the narrative, and forced in a callback towards the game's end. I'm not even saying this story doesn't have a place in the game, it just feels like a side quest. Why was it in the main quest? Or let's take a look at Desh and his story arc. We first find the man in the dragon's nest, like I said, and learn he has amnesia, but he feels compelled to tag along on our quest. When visiting the village of the ancients later in the game, we meet a bunch of ancients who tell us of times past. We learn that long ago the ancients activated the crystals of light, but couldn't contain its power, causing a catastrophic event called the Wrath of Light. 4 heroes from the world of darkness stopped the apocalypse, and in their shame from almost causing an apocalypse, the ancients founded this village to live the rest of their lives in solitude. I learned in my post-game research that this is an entirely optional area, but finding it introduces some interesting and relevant lore regarding the balance of light and dark that exists in the Final Fantasy universe. At one point, it was the warriors of dark that needed to save the world. Now it's the heroes of light who must do so. Now that's all neat, and we learn later that Desh is a descendant of the ancients, and was kept asleep until a time when he would awaken to save the world. We learn that he and his father built the Tower of Owen, a structure that keeps that floating island from crashing to Earth. That's cool as hell, only Desh must sacrifice himself during an assault on the tower to keep it floating. His sacrifice is similar to some story moments in the second game, and I was sad to see the dude go. He spent more than enough time with the party making funny remarks and being an all-around memorable character. But near the game's ending, we find out that Desh is still alive, as he's also one of the pure hearts that saves us from the curse. This reveal just feels cheap. After tagging along with the party and making an impression due to his goofy personality, and the eventual revelation that he's an ancient, Desh's supposed death had impact. He saved our party and fulfilled his duty of saving the world. We were devastated, and he left his mark on the world in other ways too, such as the girl who was emotionally destroyed upon hearing of his demise. When he's revealed to have been alive, it's because he's one of 5 pure hearts required to prevent a curse? Again, why couldn't this have just been 4 hearts? Why did Desh need to be a part of this? He made his mark on the story by this point, and the plot could have easily left him alone and it wouldn't have changed at all. This moment just wasn't earned and feels rushed to try and generate a cheap twist. The only people with a long-lasting connection to the party are Doga and Une, magical beings tied to Xande in his past. In fact, they trained alongside him under a powerful mage named Noah. Noah gave gifts to his 3 students. Doga received uber-powerful magic, Une gained control over the Dream Realm, and Xande gained mortality. Xande didn't want to be mortal and went on a rampage that drained the water and earth crystals, which flooded the world and caused that part of it to float above the rest. In the game's latter half, Doga and Une understand that Xande must be stopped and ask the party to kill them so we can use their souls to acquire the keys of Eureka and the Crystal Tower, which are vital parts of the endgame. Thing is, their souls come back to revive the party during a fatal time, and it just doesn't make sense how they'd still be alive. We use their souls to make keys, why are they still here? And yes, I know Doga and Une state before their death that their spirits can't die or whatever, but that doesn't make this any less cheap. If anything, them being able to do pretty much anything makes me wonder why they aren't saving the world instead of us. Doga and Une had an interesting background with legitimate ties to the villain and sacrificed themselves for a greater narrative, only to come back and ruin it all. See, the lore in this world is fantastic. Characters have strong backgrounds and motivations, but the storytelling presenting these characters does a poor job building up tension and getting us to care about what happened, since anything with consequence is eventually redacted. The heroes are always just behind the villains. We're rarely at a point where they're far ahead of the party and we're feeling threatened with overwhelming odds to overcome. Anytime we're about to hit that moment, someone comes back to life at the most convenient time possible. With so many side stories thrown into the main plot, the enemies are hardly built up, and it just doesn't feel like the world is ending. It feels like I'm on a fun little adventure. It might feel like I'm giving Game 1 a pass since it had similar detached moments, but I'm not. It's just in Final Fantasy 3, there's more writing and dialogue that puts a ton of emphasis on moments in this game compared to the first, only for the events to be fairly inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. And even when events are consequential, that consequence isn't lasting, which weakens any stakes the story may have had. That, and maybe since playing Final Fantasy 2 opened my mind up to what a plot in these games could be, it was disappointing to see that regress in Game 3 despite its gameplay improvements. As much as I'm ranting, whether this more lighthearted focus on story is better or worse is up to the player. But I was surprised to find that I was actually missing the more dramatic moments presented in Final Fantasy 2. The story was one of the only good elements of that game, and it would have been neat to experience a darker tale with 3's improved gameplay. But now that I'm on the record defending Final Fantasy 2, it's important to note that Square's third outing isn't ruined by this serviceable story. Not even close. Nothing here is fundamentally broken, it's just that the game's plot doesn't hold up to a critical examination. And hey, there's no stupid memorize system, and that's a win in my book. Also, it's important to note that the shift in focus was intentional. In 2020, Square published a 30-year anniversary interview with designers Hiromichi Tanaka and Koichi Ishii, who stated that at the time of developing Final Fantasy 3, there were rumblings of an SNES, meaning the team wanted to go out with a bang on the Famicom. Not only this, but NES carts were double the size they were during Final Fantasy 2's development, meaning there was so much more room to take advantage of, which explains the game's massive world. Tanaka also notes that Final Fantasy 3 was more mechanics focused than story focused because Akitoshi Kawazu wasn't involved. I'm assuming Tanaka is referring to Final Fantasy 2 with that line, even though Kawazu is credited as a designer for Final Fantasy 2, while our boy Hironobu Sakaguchi and Kenji Terada took on the writing. That, and the team fleshed out Final Fantasy 2's plot before going full on into development. Kawazu might have had more influence on Final Fantasy 2's plot than he's given credit for. That's what I pulled from that interview, at least. But regardless of its overall impact, it's impossible to deny that Final Fantasy 3's tale presents some noteworthy moments. I just wish there was more of a balance between cool side content and vital main stuff. For instance, you don't just get one airship in this game. You don't even just get two. You swap between 4 airships throughout your journey. One you use to smash into and destroy a rock instead of, flying over it. Another can dive underwater to explore secret caves, and another lets you jump over mountains instead of, flying over them. As funny as that is, I don't love that Square artificially lengthened the game by preventing your airship from flying over mountains, but since the airship is so prevalent in this game, limiting the areas an earlier airship can access helps ensure players aren't flying into battles they're not ready for. These restrictions make the game more linear, which is a good thing, even if it doesn't make any logical sense. The final airship also provides a safe area where you can buy items, armor, and sleep to restore health, and I hope future Final Fantasy games allow me to do this and customize my airship as a sort of portable base. I love this type of stuff in games. Oh, and it even lets me call in the Fat Chocobo. Have I mentioned the Fat Chocobo? Well, it's a massive chocobo that acts as item storage, appearing in forests and some key other areas throughout the game, assuming you have Gishal greens to attract them. Unfortunately, the Fat Chocobo doesn't really serve a purpose in the Pixel remaster since we now have unlimited inventory slots, and it's a good idea to keep tons of equipment on hand if you're switching jobs frequently. But he's still cool and another great example of the game's eccentric personality. I'm glad they didn't get rid of him. Or there's the town of Falgabard, which is meant to prep heroes to train as the Dark Knight job. At this point, Max was already one of those, so I thought it a no-brainer to head there and acquire some job-specific weapons. Here I find a secret cave behind a waterfall, and find an old man seeking out someone worthy of holding the Kiku Ichimonji. Well, Max already has that equipped, as I found it elsewhere, and I wrecked the dude in 2 turns, so I'd say I'm worthy. He then gives me another one, and Max can now dual-wield the things, which is awesome. You'll turn into frogs to save the Tower of Owen, only to realize frogs can't do physical damage, so your attacks have to be magical, and physical jobs are useless. You'll stop a civil war from destroying a kingdom, and even earn a reward for riding a chocobo all around the known land. And while most of the story is made up of disjointed plot points and only a few connect to the overall narrative, there's still value in the game as Square intends to challenge the player through gameplay in the job system as mentioned earlier. The gameplay in the story coalesce like no other, however, when it comes to the end game. Final Fantasy III's endgame is infamous for being incredibly difficult. It requires you to survive a gauntlet made up of the Crystal Tower in the World of Darkness. Getting there requires the 4 elemental fangs, which the party uses to destroy Xande's gates that prevented access. We clear those, jump over a few mountain passes with the airship, and enter an area surrounding the Dark Tower, the Ancient's Maze. At this point in the game, my party consists of Max as a Dark Knight, who has powerful weapons and can use Blade Blitz to attack multiple enemies in one turn, Aya as the healing-centric White Mage, Norm as the damage-dealing Black Mage, and Liara as a Dragoon to take advantage of that destructive jump ability. Jump is funny because it means Liara is away for every other turn, meaning she'll miss some heals and damage. That said, if she's low on health, I have to avoid making her jump and hope she gets healed before an enemy attacks her. Also, Liara being in the air means the enemy will focus on my other 3 heroes more, meaning they're prone to take more damage than otherwise. So there's always some balance despite this ability seeming incredibly overpowered. Aya and Norm have remained the same job because I like the idea of consistently leveling up at least one of my party members as high as possible, while I constantly switch Liara into the class that's most relevant to the area I'm in. All of this is about to change as I find the Earth Crystal, which provides the final required jobs in the game. We fight off the Titan defending the crystal, who just keeps using Quake on the party, but fortunately Norm has his disgusting bio attack, which does good damage. I'm throwing everything I can at this man, and as he wipes Max, Aya, and Norm, I keep Liara jumping, as the Titan has to be close to death, no? And jumping helps her avoid damage. My gamble pays off, and Liara ends up winning the fight. The Earth Crystal provides me with the Devout, Magus, and Summoner jobs, though these are different in the DS remake if that's what you're used to. The Devout is a more powerful version of the White Mage with more MP and spell capacity, so naturally I give it to Aya. I know I just said I wanted her to hit a level 99 job, and she's currently at a level 75 White Mage, but the upgrade to a Devout was just too tempting, so I made the switch. It also gives her some more powerful offensive spells that she didn't have before. The same goes for Norm in the Magus class, which is the Black Mage equivalent. I don't end up using the Summoner class. Next is the Crystal Tower, which includes an area called the Forbidden Land, or Eureka. Eureka's entrance is at the start of the tower. The dungeon is optional, but provides a ton of useful gear, experience, money, lots of elixirs, which are very rare magic restore items, and 2 powerful jobs: the Ninja and the Sage. The Ninja can throw shuriken in battle, which deals thousands in damage, while the Sage can harness both the damage-dealing black magic and its healing counterpart white magic, alongside summoning spells, which I didn't even get to use, so that's something I missed out on entirely. In fact, I think it's pretty neat that I was able to miss what seems like an important part of the game's combat, according to forums and everything I've read about the game. It shows that there's a lot of depth to these systems, and you have to go out of your way to take advantage of them all. There's no one way through the entire game. Every player is experiencing the game in their own unique way, and that's awesome. I know that summons are vital to the future of the series, so it's a mechanic that I'll get into more in later games. It's just not one I was able to experiment with in my playthrough. But yeah, while Eureka is not necessary, it's pretty important to surviving the challenging endgame content. Also, Eureka is where Final Fantasy III starts feeling like the previous 2, and that you're battling tons of enemies through long dungeons. And it's also one of the more visually arresting areas in the game. Many of the items are surrounded by skeletons, showcasing the history of wannabe heroes who died trying to acquire them, highlighting these items' value to the player and ensuring we feel extra rewarded for fighting each mini-boss to hold them. The rock-solid caves then give way to hovering paths, just floating there over absolutely nothing. Battles here have me constantly using Aya's Libra spell to unveil the enemy's weaknesses and HP, though it saddens me to realize most of these enemies simply don't have a weakness. Liara's consistent jumping ensures at least one of my party members is consistently alive, and the magic boost from the Magus and Devout jobs is incredibly helpful throughout. I'm also taking advantage of various items in my inventory, such as the Rune Staff, which casts Blizzaga without wasting Aya's MP, and unlike in Final Fantasy II, the third game returns these items to being unlimited use, which I'm a fan of. In between scores of enemies are some of the game's most powerful weapons, and protecting them are mini-bosses just as strong. We've got Amon, who constantly changes his weaknesses, but Aya is out of MP for Libra, so I can't check what he's switching to, forcing me to wail attacks on the man until he dies. That said, if I use an elemental attack that's attuned to his defense, it simply heals him. Sure, I could use an elixir to restore Aya's MP since there are so many to find here in Eureka, but I challenged myself to get through the dungeon without using any. So instead I subject myself to a terrifying 10-minute fight, but I ultimately come out on top. We've also got Kunoichi guarding the Masamune, a powerful warrior weapon I've used in previous games. Max already does tons of damage with his base attack, so I'm hoping to bank on that for this fight. However, this is also the fight I learned that Reflect, a spell that redirects magic attacks from the one protected by it, can be just as useful to me as they are the enemy. After casting Reflect on Max since he's the biggest damage dealer, then using Curaja to try and heal my entire party, I learned that the Reflect spell prevents Max from being cured, instead reflecting it onto Kunoichi and giving them an entire 4,000 points of HP, which is about as much damage as I had done to them this entire battle. I thought this mistake would mark my party's end, but I keep on pushing and reviving with Phoenix Downs and end up winning the fight without using a single elixir and with all 4 party members alive. Reflect did come in clutch here, as Kunoichi uses a lot of magic, so I just made sure to note who had Reflect on and who didn't, ensuring I didn't even heal those who had it active, so I didn't risk healing Kunoichi as well. Feeling quite pleased with myself, my joy is short-lived as I come across the General. With next to no magic points, 2 of my party members are essentially useless during this fight, so I was forced to use an elixir on both I and Norm, but I'm still happy with how far I got before breaking. I make short work of the General with my more powerful spells, and off I go. My efforts are especially rewarded at the dungeon's end, which includes various shopkeepers where I buy some new spells, items, and most importantly, Shuriken for the ninja class. Shuriken is a powerhouse item that can do 9,999 damage even to the end boss, so it's a must for players who are new to the game and haven't been min-maxing their party. What's interesting though is the Shuriken merchant is hidden, though that secret is a little ruined by the Pixel Remaster's minimap, which is an unfortunate side effect of making the game more accessible, but again, it's nothing game-breaking. That endgame is still difficult regardless. I spend some extra time down here grinding, switch Liara to the ninja class and Norman Aya to sages, and head out of Eureka. Also, while Eureka is a tough 6th floor dungeon, you can finish it and go back into the world before doing the rest of the endgame Gauntlet. With all of Eureka's mini-bosses and rare items, but the ability to leave, heal, and come back, it's more of a preview of what's to come, if you will. I imagine players of the original Final Fantasy III took twice as long as my hour-and-a-half or so venture into the Forbidden Land. There are tons of hidden paths here, not just the one that leads to the Shuriken Merchant, but entering one of these paths shows the rest of them on the main and minimap. This is a feature that almost feels unintentional, as it kind of defeats the point of secret paths in the first place, but it must have just been done to make the Pixel Remaster more accessible. But now that I'm done with Eureka, it's time for the real endgame. The Crystal Tower is 8 floors of tough battles, including various colored dragons that are tougher than most enemies I've faced by now. Fun fact, in the NES version, these dragons dropped Onion Knight armor. The Onion Knight was the default class in the NES version, and was fairly weak until the character reaches level 92, or maybe it's 90? I keep reading conflicting info. Either way, from there, every Onion Knight class level increases every stat by 12 points, making them a powerhouse class by level 99 if you choose to take that route. In the original game, players would grind the hell out of these dragons to gather Onion gear, which consisted of a helmet, armor, gauntlets, a sword, and a shield. They'd have to fight hundreds of these dragons for a chance to earn 1 piece of armor, let alone entire sets for all 4 party members. The shit's insane. From what I can gather, this is possible in the Pixel Remaster as well, while the Nintendo DS Remake had its own convoluted way of acquiring the gear. On top of the Crystal Tower is a cursed mirror that paralyzes anyone who looks into it, making them the perfect prey for the surrounding dragons. Conveniently for our team, Doga appears and goes off to find 5 pure hearts of light, the only thing that can cure such a curse. He goes off to grab the princess, Sid, Desh, a prince from the earlier story moment I mentioned, and hilariously, one of the old dudes who pretended to be a hero of light. We already know my feelings on this, but hey, at least we get to see Sid again. From here, we break on through the 9th floor, only to find Xande himself. Xande absolutely destroys my party on my first attempt, thanks to his meteor spell, which all but wipes every party member in one hit. Thing is, we're doing decent damage to him as well, hitting 1 to 2k per attack. So I assume I just need to get lucky with the RNG and hope Xande doesn't use Meteor over and over and over again in my next fight. My second attempt goes much better, as Xande foolishly attacks my party one at a time with fairly weak attacks in comparison to Meteor, so I'm able to wipe him out in a few turns, actually using Meteor myself to deal some extra damage. I've noticed this RNG factor in all 3 games, where a fight might seem impossible during one attempt, but bearable the second simply because the boss changes their attack patterns. I like this level of unpredictability. It adds to the fun and prevents me from using one strategy for every enemy, rather forcing me to change up which abilities I use and how I defend my party with each battle. Xande's final words mention the Cloud of Darkness, the game's true enemy. It appears and crushes my party, with all of our attacks missing in our fight. Of course, this is supposed to happen, and the 5 hearts come to revive us, along with the spirits of Doga and Une, because the game's story moments mean absolutely nothing. Let's enter the World of Darkness. The World of Darkness reminds me a lot of the final area in Pandemonium in Final Fantasy II. The land is a similar shade of bluish purple, and it's hovering over empty space, which is simply terrifying. Right away, I notice there are areas in each corner of the map, but I want to fight this final boss, so I instead head toward a path in the middle. This is a big mistake, and one I assume Square wanted the player to fall for, considering this path is right in front of you upon spawning. The middle path leads me right to the Cloud of Darkness, but it notes that we are trying to use light while in the realm of darkness and how that probably won't work. And surprise, it doesn't. I get absolutely smashed. Once again, this was supposed to happen, but I have some agency over the situation this time. I learned from a little research that those corners from before are actually quite important. It turns out that each one houses one of the Warriors of Dark, who, as we know, had saved the world from the Ancients' mistake of trying to control the power of light. Now it's our turn to save the world, but this threat is so massive that it requires the warriors of both sides. By attempting to battle the Cloud of Darkness without the Warriors of Dark, I'm challenging it at full power and just asking to get my ass handed to me. Acquiring the warriors ensures the cloud is weakened and that I can actually stand a chance against it. The Warriors of Darkness are a neat foil to my Warriors of Light, and it's cool to see the game acknowledge that darkness isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's important to have balance in all things, even light and dark, and Final Fantasy III details what happens if there is too much of either one. Too much dark results in the Cloud of Darkness manipulating Xande in his anger and taking over the world, while too much light almost enveloped the world and destroyed everything. So much talk of light and dark. Now I know why Kingdom Hearts is so obnoxious.
Darkness, heart, darkness.
Getting to these heroes is no easy task, however, requiring I battle through all manner of difficult foe. There are evil spirit recreations of Une and Doga, terrifying dragons like Jormungand, a clone of Xande, or even a two-headed dragon. You get the gist of these endgame battles by now, so I won't go into them, but rest assured that they're a worthy challenge from my party. None of them even have elemental weaknesses. There's a mini-boss before each warrior as well, also similar to Eureka, but I get through each one with some thoughtful tactics. Part of clearing these areas was made easier thanks to the healing crystals that appear after saving each Warrior of Dark. Not only this, but I can quick save wherever I like. The original Final Fantasy III required players to go through the Crystal Tower in the World of Darkness in one try, which is how it became known for its difficulty. If they died, they had to start all over again. Hearing about this difficulty is mainly why I kept all of my elixirs, but I learned they weren't really necessary thanks to these healing crystals and quick saves. In fact, thanks to these crystals, I found this endgame much easier than 1 and 2. But hey, I'm not going to complain about something that heals my party at no cost, it's just something worth noting. Either way, I slowly made my way through and built up my team of heroes, both light and dark, before returning to the Cloud of Darkness itself. This time, things are a little different. The warriors weaken the cloud and we enter battle. What's interesting at first is that all 4 of my party members attack before the cloud for multiple turns, allowing me to do over 10k damage while also healing my party with little risk. This leads me to believe the boss will be a cakewalk, as it just keeps using its particle beam, which does hit all 4 of us, but it happens after all 4 of us attack and heal each turn. Though things do take a turn for the worse when I realize we're not healing enough with each turn. Despite restoring thousands of HP with every heal, the cloud's particle beam is doing more damage to most characters than I can restore, meaning I'm experiencing a net loss of health with every turn. Things get even worse when the cloud attacks before my party is finished, and Max is wiped due to this unplanned move. From there, my strategy is gone, and we're defeated by this oh-so-clever mass of gas. I do about an hour's worth of grinding after the fact to bring my party to a level 50 average. I try Max as a ninja, but resort back to the Dark Knight, provide Max and Liara with shields instead of two-handing weapons, become a millionaire, and equip my party with ribbons before I head back to fight the cloud. Ribbons are a key item here that you can find in Eureka and the World of Darkness that protects from status effects, and are highly recommended for this battle. I use Liara's shuriken to deal massive damage right away, then utilize her and Max to provide elixirs to my mage job so that they can focus on damaging spells. Sure, I have to take some turns to revive and heal my party as my mages, and ensuring a non-mage uses the Phoenix down while a mage heals to maximize my turns, and continue with this method until the cloud dies. This grinding also ensured Aya's healing was more powerful, which means that I was earning more of the HP than I was losing whenever the cloud uses particle beam, which was quite useful. Either way, I win with my entire party alive, which sweetens the victory, and the cloud dissipates. Also, fun fact, the DS version of this boss has tentacles you can attack alongside the main cloud, and apparently it's much harder than the Famicom version. But I digress. After beating the cloud, I'm greeted with some walls of text about how hope will always prevail and save the world, and how we mustn't let time erase our lives and memories. We cut to my party, who's surrounded by the pure hearts, and head to the airship to drop them all off at home. Even if I don't think half of these characters deserve to be here from a story sense, I still enjoy dropping each one of them off to the towns I've spent time in, which brings back all the fun adventures I had in each one. There's also a few moments to let the writing's personality shine, such as Desh finally reuniting with his love and remembering her, or seeing Sid and his wife talk about, yeah, that's weird. Also, her name is Mrs. Sid. What is that? You cannot tell me that more effort went to the story and characters than the gameplay in this title. Even as everyone leaves, Max isn't left alone, as Princess Sarah makes her intentions to stay with us quite clear, despite us not having developed any relationship throughout the game. I also find it hilarious that the whole party is definitely here, but she's only talking to the main member. It's just a weird moment of dissonance that never fails to make me laugh. Sarah even gets jealous when a dancer back at home wants a kiss, which is endearing in its own way. The light of the crystals returns, our town looks off into the distance, and the game ends. Nice! I know I went in on the storytelling, but this was a pretty great game even by today's standards, though the Pixel Remaster's modern touches certainly helped with that. This aside, I really enjoyed the game's combat innovations, such as the job system or its renewed focus on more thoughtful battles instead of just throwing hordes of enemies at you. This is definitely a game that would have blown my mind during its Famicom release period. I also love the emphasis on secret and side content here, even if that surely had an effect on the main story development. There are so many hidden areas and items, and even with all of my exploring, I apparently missed a lot. Beating the game unlocks its bestiary, which shows that I fought only 167 of the 225 enemies. That's 58 enemies I totally missed out on, and a great reason to go back and clear out what I've missed. Also, I'm aware this analysis didn't even cover things like the game's audio or its monster designs, which are both excellent, but I wanted to focus on what stood out the most to me specifically, and it was definitely the gameplay and story alterations that caught my attention most. This is a sequel Square should be proud of, and a fantastic step forward for the iconic series, no doubt. I've heard Final Fantasy 4 and 5 are smaller steps up from here, refining the formula rather than introducing something monumentally new, but I'm still excited to try them out. And then of course we've got 6 and 7 from there. Thanks for watching, you all. Even with a while between uploads, I noticed the channel is growing at a crazy rate, and I can't thank you all enough for the support. I'm not sure what my next video will be, either the next part in my Resident Evil 2 series or coverage of an indie game, but by the time you're watching this, I should be well into production of whatever that is. I'll see y'all next time.